The abandoned psychiatric hospital had always been a source of fascination for Jason. A dilapidated relic on the edge of town, it loomed over the forest like a brooding shadow, its windows shattered and walls draped in graffiti. Locals called it Whispering Pines, a name as deceiving as the serene backdrop it provided. For decades, it was a magnet for urban explorers, ghost hunters, and thrill-seeking teenagers. But Jason had a different reason for his visit. His sister, Mia, had disappeared 2 weeks ago. The last place anyone saw her was near Whispering Pines. Police found her car parked by the gravel road leading into the forest but no sign of her. Jason refused to accept their conclusion, that she had wandered off and succumbed to the harsh wilderness. Mia wasn't the type to get lost. She was adventurous but not reckless. And then there were the rumors. Locals whispered about ghostly voices in the woods and shadowy figures in the hospital's upper windows. Some swore they heard distant screams during quiet nights, while others recounted tales of unexplained lights flickering in the building. Jason dismissed most of it as folklore, until the police found no leads. Equipped with a flashlight, a backpack, and a deep sense of determination, Jason arrived at the hospital under the cover of twilight. The setting sun painted the building in hues of gold and orange, but the warm colors did nothing to alleviate the chill creeping up his spine. The front doors hung askew, their hinges rusted and weak. Jason pushed one open, the screech of metal echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was stale and damp, carrying the unmistakable scent of mildew. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and walls scrawled with ominous messages. "Leave now, Red One," the letters jagged and smeared in what he hoped was red paint. Another declared, "They never left." Jason swallowed hard and ventured further. He wasn't afraid of ghosts or curses, he was afraid of not finding Mia. The ground floor was uneventful, save for the constant creaks and groans of the old building. Jason tried to dismiss the sensation of being watched, chalking it up to nerves. He found a stairwell leading to the second floor and hesitated. Something about the darkness above felt different, thicker, heavier, almost alive. As he ascended, a faint sound stopped him. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a whisper. He froze, holding his breath to listen. Jason. His name, drawn out in a raspy, sing-song tone, sent shivers racing down his spine. He spun around, shining his flashlight back down the stairwell. Empty. Only the sound of his own panicked breathing filled the space. "Get it together," he muttered, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Mia needs you." The second floor was worse than the first. The walls were lined with broken gurneys and overturned wheelchairs. The smell was stronger here, rotting wood and something metallic. Jason's light flickered, and he cursed, smacking the flashlight until the beam steadied. He moved cautiously, his footsteps crunching over debris. A door on his left caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, unlike the others, and a faint glow emanated from within. Jason's heart raced as he approached, his instinct screaming to turn back. But he couldn't. Not until he knew. He nudged the door open with the toe of his boot. Inside, the glow came from an old lantern sitting on the floor. Its flame flickered weakly, casting shadows that danced across the walls. And there, in the corner of the room, was something that made Jason's blood run cold. A figure sat hunched over, rocking slightly. Their back was to him, and their clothes were filthy, torn in places. Jason stepped closer, swallowing his fear. "Mia," he whispered. The figure stopped rocking. Slowly, it turned its head toward him, revealing a face that wasn't Mia's, or anyone's. The features were grotesque, the skin stretched unnaturally tight over the skull. Hollow eyes glared at him, and a wide, unnatural grin spread across its face. Jason stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the floor. The figure let out a guttural growl and lunged. Jason scrambled, grabbing the flashlight and darting out of the room. He ran down the hall, his breath ragged and his heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction. They were all around him now, filling his ears with incoherent murmurs and the occasional scream. He burst into another stairwell, this one leading downward. Jason hesitated, but the sound of footsteps closing in behind him left no choice. He descended into the basement, the air growing colder with every step. Jason hit the bottom step of the basement, his breathing uneven and loud in the oppressive silence. He swung his flashlight around, the beam cutting through thick, swirling dust. The basement was a maze of crumbling walls and exposed pipes, with an oppressive darkness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. A soft hum filled the air. It was faint at first, like the buzz of a distant light bulb, but it grew louder as Jason moved forward. The sound had a strange, hypnotic rhythm, tugging at his senses and making it hard to think. He stopped in front of a metal door at the end of the hallway. It was newer than the rest of the building, its surface smooth and unmarked. Jason's fingers hesitated over the handle. This wasn't on the building's blueprints, he'd studied them obsessively while planning his search. Who installed it? And why? He twisted the handle, and the door creaked open to reveal a vast, dimly lit chamber. The walls were lined with tall shelves crammed with dusty medical equipment, old files, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood a surgical table. Above it, a single, flickering light bulb swayed gently, casting erratic shadows. Jason stepped inside, his gaze falling on the table. It was stained with something dark and sticky, the metal clamps at its edges gleaming under the weak light. A sense of wrongness seeped into his bones. He backed away, intending to leave, but his foot caught on something. He looked down and froze. A photograph, half buried in the dirt, stared back at him. It was old and yellowed, showing a group of people in white coats standing in front of the hospital. At the center of the group was a man with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. Jason's heart stopped when he realized he recognized the man. It was the figure he'd seen upstairs. The humming grew louder, morphing into a low chant. Jason turned, his flashlight illuminating the far corner of the room. There, etched into the concrete floor, was a massive, intricate symbol. Strange markings surrounded it, forming a circle that pulsed faintly with an unnatural light. Jason. The whisper was back, louder this time and unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from inside his head. He clutched at his temples, trying to drown out the voice, but it only grew stronger. Jason, she's here. He staggered forward, drawn to the glowing symbol against his will. His body moved as if in a trance, each step heavier than the last. As he neared the circle, the air grew colder, and the chanting became deafening. Jason dropped to his knees at the edge of the markings, his flashlight rolling away. A hand shot out from the center of the symbol. Thin and pale, its fingers twitched and clawed at the air. Jason scrambled back, his heart pounding like a drum. The hand was followed by an arm, then a head. The figure that emerged was skeletal, its face stretched into a grotesque grin. Jason, it rasped, its voice like nails on glass. Welcome. Jason wanted to scream, but his throat closed up. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes boring into his soul. You came for her, didn't you? It said, its grin widening. Your dear sister. She's so close. Jason forced himself to speak, his voice shaking. Where is she? What have you done with her? The figure tilted its head, almost mockingly. She's here. But she's changed. It reached into the glowing circle and pulled something out. Jason's stomach turned as he recognized it, Mia's necklace. The one she never took off. Bring her back. Jason shouted, his fear replaced by rage. Give her back to me. The figure cackled, its laughter echoing off the walls. You want her? Then join us. The door is open. The ground beneath Jason trembled, and the markings on the floor glowed brighter. The room seemed to warp, the shelves stretching impossibly high and the air growing suffocatingly thick. Jason's flashlight flickered wildly, and for a brief moment, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The shelves weren't just filled with medical equipment. They were filled with jars, and inside each jar was a face. Human faces, contorted in expressions of terror, floated in murky liquid. Jason stumbled backward, his mind reeling. The figure moved closer, its skeletal hand reaching for him. Jason grabbed his flashlight and swung it wildly, the metal connecting with a sickening crunch. The figure shrieked, its form flickering like a bad TV signal. Jason didn't wait for it to recover. He bolted out of the room, slamming the metal door behind him. The chanting followed him up the stairs, growing louder with every step. Jason didn't look back. He burst onto the first floor, his lungs burning and his heart racing. He could still hear the whispers, but they were fainter now, as if the hospital itself was letting him go. As he reached the front doors, he heard it again, Mia's voice, soft and pleading. "Jason, don't leave me." Jason froze at the doorway, Mia's voice pulling him back like a tether. His hand gripped the splintered edge of the frame, torn between the chilling unknown inside and the relative safety of the outside world. "Jason," the voice came again, faint and desperate. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. The beam swept over crumbling walls and shattered glass but found no sign of her. His rational mind screamed that it was a trick, another cruel game from whatever force controlled this place. But his heart wouldn't let him abandon the possibility. "Mia," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty halls. "Where are you?" The only response was silence. Then, faintly, footsteps, soft, tentative, and coming from the second floor. Jason's grip on the flashlight tightened as he retraced his steps, ascending the stairs once more. Every creak of the old wood beneath his feet sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. The second floor felt different this time. The air was heavier, colder. Shadows seemed to stretch and ripple unnaturally, retreating just out of reach of the flashlight's glow. Jason's every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't, not without Mia. As he walked down the hallway, he noticed the walls had changed. The graffiti was gone, replaced by strange symbols carved into the plaster. They pulsed faintly, their glow matching the rhythm of his racing heart. At the end of the corridor, a door stood ajar. Unlike the others, it wasn't broken or covered in grime. It looked almost pristine, its brass handle gleaming as though it had been polished. Jason hesitated, his breathing shallow. "Mia," he called out, his voice cracking. The door creaked open wider in response, as if inviting him in. Jason stepped forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The room beyond was a stark contrast to the decayed surroundings. It was clean, almost sterile, with white walls and a single bed in the center. On the bed sat Mia. Jason's heart leapt into his throat. "Mia." She looked up, her face pale but unmistakably hers. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and her hands trembled as she reached for him. "Jason," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "You found me." Relief washed over him, and he rushed to her side, dropping the flashlight on the bed. He grasped her hands, the warmth of her skin grounding him. "I thought I lost you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We need to get out of here." Mia nodded weakly. "It's not safe here. They won't let us leave." Jason frowned, his relief giving way to confusion. "Who? What are you talking about?" Her eyes darted around the room, fear etched into every line of her face. "They're watching. They're always watching." A loud crash outside the room made them both jump. Jason grabbed the flashlight, his pulse spiking. "Stay behind me," he ordered, positioning himself between Mia and the door. The shadows outside seemed to writhe and crawl toward the doorway, their movements jerky and unnatural. Jason's flashlight flickered as he aimed it at the encroaching darkness, and for a brief moment, he saw them, figures, tall and skeletal, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of malice. Jason backed up, his mind racing. "We need to move, now." Mia grabbed his arm. "They'll follow us. They don't let anyone leave." "I don't care," Jason snapped. "We'll figure it out." He pulled her to her feet and led her out of the room. The hallway was alive now, the walls shifting and groaning as though the building itself was trying to trap them. The shadows closed in, their whispers rising to a cacophony. Jason and Mia sprinted down the corridor, the flashlight barely illuminating their path. The stairs came into view, but as they neared, the floor beneath them cracked and split open. Jason yanked Mia back just in time, watching in horror as the ground caved in, revealing a yawning void below. A deafening roar erupted from the abyss, and Jason felt the pull of an unseen force dragging them toward it. He clung to Mia, digging his heels into the splintering wood. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the din. Mia screamed, her grip slipping. Jason's flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering into the void and extinguishing. Darkness enveloped them, and Jason felt his hold on Mia weakening. "No," he shouted, but it was too late. Mia was wrenched from his grasp, her scream fading as she disappeared into the abyss. Jason's world spun. The ground beneath him gave way, and he fell into the void. Time lost meaning as he tumbled through the blackness, his body weightless and his mind drowning in terror. Then, suddenly, it was over. Jason landed with a jarring thud on cold, damp concrete. He groaned, his body aching as he pushed himself up. He was back in the basement, the faint hum of the glowing circle returning to his ears. "Mia," he called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. A soft laugh answered him, chilling in its familiarity. Jason turned, his breath catching in his throat. Mia stood in the center of the glowing circle, her face blank and her eyes hollow. "You shouldn't have come, Jason," she said, her voice layered with something inhuman. "Now you belong to them too." The room exploded in light, and Jason's screams were swallowed by the darkness. Jason's scream echoed endlessly in the void before abruptly cutting off as he gasped awake. He was lying on the cold, damp concrete again, his flashlight somehow beside him, its weak beam illuminating the edges of the room. The circle at the center of the floor no longer glowed, but its intricate lines pulsed faintly, as if alive. "Mia," he croaked, forcing himself upright. His body felt heavy, as though he was dragging an unseen weight. The memory of her hollow eyes and unnatural voice sent a shiver through him. Was she even still his sister? The room had changed. The walls were no longer lined with shelves of grotesque jars but instead covered with mirrors, each reflecting twisted, distorted versions of the room, and of Jason himself. In one, his face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken into dark pits. In another, he was covered in wounds, his flesh torn and oozing. "Jason," the whisper came again, but this time it was different, layered, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the mirrors. Each one now showed not just him, but something moving behind him, just out of reach of the light. It was tall, skeletal, and shrouded in shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. "Leave me alone," Jason shouted, the sound of his voice trembling but defiant. The mirrors cracked in unison, the sound deafening. Shards fell to the ground, but instead of scattering, they hovered mid-air, swirling around him like a storm. Jason shielded his face as the shards began to pulse with light, their edges glowing with an unnatural energy. One by one, the shards flew into the center of the room, embedding themselves into the floor where the circle had been. They formed a jagged, crystalline tower that pulsed with the same faint glow as the symbol before. The humming returned, louder this time, accompanied by distant whispers that Jason couldn't make out. "Jason," a voice said, louder and clearer than the rest. He turned to see Mia standing at the edge of the room. Her eyes were no longer hollow, but her expression was one of deep sadness. She stepped closer, her movements slow and deliberate. Mia! Jason exclaimed, rushing toward her. She held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. Don't! You can't save me, Jason. You should have left when you had the chance. Jason's chest tightened. What are you talking about? I came here for you. I'm not leaving without you. Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You don't understand. They've taken me. I'm not the sister you remember. I haven't been for a long time. Jason's stomach churned as he noticed the faint glow surrounding her, the same as the one in the circle and the shards. That's not true. You're still you. I know it. The humming grew louder, and Mia flinched, her hands clutching her head. They're coming. You have to go. I'm not leaving without you. Jason yelled, stepping closer. The crystalline tower in the center of the room began to crack, fissures spreading like lightning as the glow intensified. Jason felt the ground tremble beneath his feet, and the air grew colder, cutting through him like a blade. Mia's body stiffened, her eyes rolling back as her voice became layered again. If you stay, you'll never leave. The crystalline tower exploded, sending shards of light scattering in every direction. Jason threw himself to the ground as the air filled with an otherworldly roar. When he looked up, Mia was gone. In her place stood the skeletal figure he'd seen before, its hollow eyes blazing with a terrible light. You were warned, it rasped, its voice shaking the walls. Jason scrambled to his feet, backing away as the figure advanced. He swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the shadows but having no effect on the creature. What do you want? Jason demanded, his voice trembling. You, it hissed, its grin widening unnaturally. You've seen too much. You belong to us now. Jason's mind raced. He needed a way out, a way to escape this nightmare. His gaze fell on the mirrors, or what was left of them. The shards still hovered in the air, their glow faint but persistent. He remembered the moment they had formed the tower and realized they might be his only chance. The figure lunged, its skeletal hand outstretched. Jason ducked and darted toward the shards, his heart pounding. He reached out, grabbing one of the glowing fragments. The instant his fingers closed around it, pain shot through his arm, but he held on, using the shard to slash at the creature. The shard struck the figure's arm, and it recoiled with a shriek. Black smoke poured from the wound, and the creature's form flickered like a dying flame. Jason didn't hesitate, he grabbed another shard, then another, until both hands were filled. Stay back, he shouted, wielding the shards like weapons. The creature hesitated, its hollow eyes narrowing. You cannot fight us forever. Watch me, Jason growled, slashing at the air. The creature shrieked again, retreating toward the remnants of the glowing circle. Jason seized the opportunity, darting past it and toward the stairs. He clutched the shards tightly, their glow dimming with each passing moment. The whispers grew louder as he ascended, the shadows reaching for him like grasping hands. Jason swung the shards wildly, carving a path through the darkness. The whispers turned into screams, and the air seemed to vibrate with rage. Finally, he burst through the front doors of the hospital and into the cool night air. The oppressive weight lifted from his chest, and the whispers faded into silence. Jason staggered away from the building, his legs barely supporting him. When he reached the edge of the forest, he collapsed, the shards slipping from his hands. For a moment, he lay there, staring up at the stars, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But as he looked back at the hospital, he saw a faint glow emanating from the windows. The building seemed to pulse, as though alive, and Jason knew the nightmare wasn't over. Mia's voice echoed in his mind one last time. You can't save me, Jason. But you can save yourself. He turned away, his heart heavy, and disappeared into the forest, leaving whispering pines and its horrors behind. Jason's feet dragged through the dense underbrush as he stumbled deeper into the forest. He didn't know where he was going, He just needed to get as far away from Whispering Pines as possible. Yet, despite his best efforts, it felt as if the forest wasn't letting him go. The moonlight filtered through the branches above, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The faint glow of the hospital windows still lingered in the corner of his vision, no matter how far he walked. It was as if the place were tethered to him, refusing to release its hold. Jason clutched his side, pain radiating from the gash he'd sustained during his escape. Blood soaked through his shirt, but he pressed on, ignoring the sting. He couldn't stop now. Stopping meant giving in, and giving in meant death, or worse. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, no distant howl of a wolf. Just silence, thick and oppressive. Jason tried to focus on his breathing, the rhythmic in and out grounding him in the present. Then, a sound, a faint rustling behind him. Jason froze, his heart pounding in his ears. He spun around, his flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The trees cast long, skeletal shadows, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking. Nothing. He turned back, picking up his pace. But the rustling followed him, growing louder with each step. "You can't escape." The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, deep and guttural, yet hauntingly familiar. Jason broke into a run, the flashlight bouncing wildly in his hand. His lungs burned, his legs screamed for relief, but he couldn't stop. The trees seemed to close in around him, their trunks twisting and warping. The forest floor turned uneven, roots rising like serpents to trip him. Jason stumbled and fell hard, the flashlight skidding out of his grasp. He scrambled to retrieve it, but as he reached out, a pale hand shot out from the darkness, grabbing his wrist. Jason screamed, jerking his arm back, but the grip was ironclad. He kicked and thrashed, his foot connecting with something solid. The hand released him, and Jason scrambled backward, his flashlight illuminating the source. It was Mia. Or at least, what was left of her. She crouched in the dirt, her hair matted and her skin deathly pale. Her hollow eyes glowed faintly, and her lips curled into a twisted smile. "Jason," she whispered, her voice layered and inhuman. "Why did you leave me?" Jason's chest tightened. "Mia. You left me," she hissed, crawling toward him on all fours like a predator stalking its prey. "You said you wouldn't leave without me." Jason scrambled to his feet, backing away. "I didn't have a choice. You told me to go." Her smile widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "I didn't want you to leave. You were supposed to stay." "Mia, this isn't you." Jason shouted, his voice trembling. "You're not her. I know you're not her." Mia, or the thing wearing her face, stopped crawling, tilting her head as if considering his words. Then, with an unsettling grace, she stood, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You're right," she said, her voice shifting, deepening. "I'm not her. But I am what she became. And soon, you will be too." The shadows around her began to ripple and rise, forming grotesque shapes with too many limbs and eyes that glowed like embers. Jason turned and ran, his flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The forest seemed endless, the trees blurring together into a maze of darkness. Jason's breaths came in ragged gasps, his mind racing. He couldn't fight whatever this was, not here, not like this. But then, up ahead, he saw it, a faint glimmer of light. Hope surged through him as he barreled toward it, the sound of his pursuers growing louder behind him. The light grew brighter, its warmth cutting through the cold, oppressive dark. Jason pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he reached the source. It was a clearing, bathed in an otherworldly glow. At its center stood a stone altar, ancient and covered in moss. Symbols similar to those in the hospital were etched into its surface, glowing faintly. Jason skidded to a stop, his gaze darting around the clearing. The shadows stopped at the edge, writhing and hissing as if unable to cross. "What is this place?" he muttered, stepping closer to the altar. As if in response, the glow intensified, and the air around him grew warmer. Jason placed his hand on the stone, and a pulse of energy shot through him, filling him with a strange sense of calm. "Jason." The voice was different this time, softer, familiar. He turned to see Mia standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes no longer hollow but filled with pain and fear. "Help me," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Jason's heart ached. "Mia." She stepped forward, her foot crossing the threshold of the clearing. The shadows recoiled, screaming as the light from the altar burned them. "Mia, don't!" Jason shouted, reaching for her. But she kept coming, her face twisting in agony as the light consumed her. "I can't stop," she cried, her voice breaking. "They won't let me." Jason's mind raced. He didn't know what to do. The altar, the light, the symbols, it had to mean something. He turned back to the stone, his fingers tracing the glowing markings. There was an indentation at the center, shaped like a handprint. Jason hesitated for only a moment before placing his palm against it. The clearing erupted in light, brighter than anything Jason had ever seen. The shadows screamed in unison, their forms disintegrating into wisps of smoke. Jason closed his eyes, the light overwhelming, his body trembling as the energy surged through him. When the light faded, the forest was still. Jason opened his eyes, his vision blurry. The clearing was empty now, the altar cold and dark. "Mia," he called out, his voice barely a whisper. There was no answer. Jason sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He had no idea if he'd saved her or lost her forever. All he knew was that the forest was silent again, and for the first time, he felt truly alone. As he stumbled out of the clearing and back into the forest, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching. The faint glow of the hospital was gone, but the whispers lingered, haunting the edges of his mind. He would never truly escape.